Sound check. Sound check. Okay, so we have sound. There's one thing I need to do. I had this pulled up, but I guess I closed it. And there we go. Make sure I have sound on my window.
That was required for you to leave the house, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I have sound on my windows. Okay, something that I wanted to talk about because it came up in the Isabella Kalua case, but I had recently watched the trial of Therian and, dear God, how did I forget her name just that quick? Therian and Ricardo Wimbush, who were on trial for severe neglect and abuse of at least two of their children. And their children, I believe they had 10 children in all, were homeschooled. Well, when it popped up again in Isabella's case, I started to think a little bit about it. And there have actually been several stories in the news where children who were homeschooled ended up being really severely abused. One of the other cases that I'm going to touch on in this live stream is the Turpin kids. There were 13 children in the Turpin family out in California. They moved from Texas to California. They were homeschooled. They were so severely abused to the point that at times they weren't even allowed to socialize amongst themselves inside the home that they were confined in. Although I don't think that homeschooling played a major part in facilitating whatever abuse Isabella suffered, I believe that is only because of the timing of her disappearance. I believe that had Isabella not disappeared when she did, for whatever reason that she disappeared, the fact that she was homeschooled would have been a major factor in covering up any abuse she was going through. The thing about homeschool children is that they don't really have a lot of exposure to the outside world as far as mandatory reporters, teachers, counselors, principals. Although I came to find out that there are homeschool co-ops where individual families who homeschool will get together to present lessons or to pay for teachers or outings or other learning materials for their homeschooled children. Um, and so these homeschool kids get social interaction that way because they're interacting with other homeschool children, they're interacting with other people outside of the home. But in the three cases that we're going to talk about, which is Ricardo Wimbush, the Turpin children, and Isabella, these children, the Winbush and Turpin children, were not in a position at all where they were exposed to anyone outside the home. We'll see that they didn't even receive medical treatment, and some of their medical issues were very severe, but it was things that you couldn't help but notice. So, had they been exposed to other people outside the home, someone would have definitely noticed this, especially if they were in a school situation where a teacher is seeing them 5 days a week, interacting with them 5 days a week. Someone would have noticed these medical issues. It would have, and the abuse or neglect would have been brought to the forefront. Well, I guess let's go ahead and get started. One of the first things that I want to touch on is Stephen Lane. Stephen Lane is a child abuse expert. I came across his name for the first time when I was initially reading Isabella's story. And he was very vocal about his feelings toward the placement of the children in the Kahlua home, the level of supervision the children were receiving, the outcome of the conferences that were had in the aftermath of Isabella's two broken bone incidents. And so I just want to quickly go through this article and refresh on some of the things that he said. All right. The adoptive parents of missing 6-year-old Waimanalo girl had pulled her out of Waimanalo Elementary School, the Department of Education confirmed Wednesday. The parents filled out paperwork to have Isabella Kahlua withdrawn and reported the reason was to homeschool her, said the Department of Education official, who could not say when that occurred. I highlighted that in red because that right there stood out to me as, and I don't know if this is true or not, because I read in another article where she had been withdrawn sometime in June from regular school. But the fact that it says this person could not say when the withdrawal occurred, the immediate thought that went through my head was the beginning of lack of supervision. To not even be able to say when she was pulled out of school. And it could be that this person was caught off guard, was not prepared for the question, and so didn't research that information. But that was my very first thought. Here, another thing. It says that Isabella's biological mother, Melanie Joseph, said the mother of a boy in her daughter's class told her she, meaning Isabella, hadn't been in school for about a week. Now, there's no time frame of reference for when this conversation took place. Did it occur before Isabella was withdrawn from school? What the logical immediate conclusion would be that this is a conversation that Melanie Joseph had with one of Isabella's classmates before she was withdrawn from school. Now, in the last year that Isabella was attending school, she was in distance learning. That may have included some elements of video classes that included other children. And it could be that she had not been seen in video sessions for about a week before this conversation occurred. There is also, and I feel like this is a less likely possibility, I mentioned homeschooling co-ops. Homeschooling co-ops may include video sessions with other homeschool students in the co-op. And possibly, if that is what happened, she had not been seen in our homeschooling co-op video session within the last week prior to this conversation. But I tend to not take it that way for the simple fact that I don't believe the Kaluas actually intended to homeschool Isabella. I believe they pulled her out for no other reason other than to hide her abuse and what was going on with her in their home. I believe that they would not have expended any resources toward even trying to make it look as if the homeschooling was a real thing, for the simple fact that they know that there was no supervision. In homeschooling, there is no requirement you don't have to meet any minimum qualifications. You don't have to provide any uh, agenda, a curriculum, course of study. You don't have to do any of that. In truth, you don't. So I just feel like they wouldn't have even taken the extra steps to make it look like they were really homeschooling her. One thing Lane said, and he said that there's no requirement to check if parents are qualified. That's why kids die. Lane says 9-year-old Hawaii girl named Shaylin Lahano Stone was starved to death by her parents and grandmother. She was homeschooled. 7 months before Lahano Stone died, her grandmother took her out of elementary school after filing a one-page homeschool request form, which greatly reduced the likelihood of someone else seeing evidence of abuse or neglect and reporting it to authorities. So we see there in Hawaii, it's only a one-page form. And I have to question how much information could they possibly be requesting from a parent who wants to homeschool if the form is only one page long, because more than likely at the top of the form there's going to be a letterhead and that's going to take up space, and at the bottom there's probably that for office use only box with a bunch of check marks and places people can sign, so that leaves a portion in the middle to ask a few questions. I would assume that you have to fill in some basic information, your name, the kid's date of birth, general statistics like that, your home address. So that leaves even less space to ask other specific questions. So we can see that they're not taking in a whole lot of information about the future plans of this child who is now going to be homeschooled and pulled out of regular school, pulled out of contact with other students, pulled um, out of the light of supervision of other adults, mandatory reporters, concerned citizens, other parents who might see them. Okay, the last thing I want to tell you in this article is another thing that Stephen Lane said. He said, probably all the Joseph kids were placed there, meaning the Kalua home, as a result of secret ghost hearings. So who's supposed to speak for the children? The 587 hearing involves custody, safety, and placement of children, all in family court and all closed. And it's possible they were placed without a hearing, he said. So if you follow Sleuth Mom, she mentioned in some of her videos that there is a fear of the Kalua family. And so that combined with the possibility that there was some shady, underhanded, possibly out of court hearings that placed the Joseph children, Sellers Joseph children, into a home where they never should have been placed as foster children due to the criminal background of one of the foster parents, it kind of makes you want to scratch your head and think again. And again, on top of that, we're gonna add they pulled her out of school supposedly to homeschool her. At the time that they pulled her out of school to homeschool her, this was after she had suffered the two separate incidents where she had broken bones. one of those incidents where she wasn't even immediately treated for the injury. So I'm going to refresh on this article as well, because this is the original article. Excuse me. This is the original article where I encountered Stephen Lang and the things that he had to say. Um, there were a few other things that he said in this article which were not mentioned in the one that I just read. It says a foster care expert says there are several red flags in 6-year-old Isabella Ariel Kalua's disappearance, the adoptive family placement. His concerns stem from her adoptive father's criminal history, which is what I mentioned before. Isaac Kalua III was convicted on 3 counts of terroristic threatening and assault charges 20 years ago and sentenced to 5 years on probation. It's inconceivable to me, and this is Mr. Lane speaking, it's inconceivable to me that anybody with that kind of criminal record and convictions of physical violence would be licensed as a foster family. Lane says another red flag is that the 6-year-old wasn't going to school in person. Here we get a little bit more of that story. I mentioned that she was not actually physically going to school during that last year, and I'm assuming that was because of the COVID-19 restrictions in place. It says the State Department of Education confirms Isabella attended kindergarten at the Waimanalo Elementary School last year via distance learning. In June, however, her adoptive parents filed a paperwork to withdraw the child and homeschool her. Lane says that's been used in the past to hide evidence of abuse. He says there is not any supervision provided for children once they are placed in homeschool. So basically, once you place a child in homeschooling, that child becomes invisible. They disappear literally from the eyes of the world, because now everything that they have to do, learning, socializing, it's all subject to your plans. What better circumstance could you possibly want if you were planning to abuse or continue or escalate abuse towards a child? I said we're going to talk about the Turpin children. Make sure I have this all in the correct order here. Now, I'm not going to go deep into the Turpin children's situation. That is a very in-depth story in itself. But there are a few things that I want to point out, because I feel like the Turpin children and the dynamics of that family and what was going on, they are probably the most bright, shining example of how homeschooling can be used to mask child abuse, even to extreme levels, because you don't have, as Mr. Lane said, there is no supervision for a child who's homeschooled. I believe I have it pulled up, but if I don't, I will go back and pull it up. Even socialization is pretty much up to the parents of the homeschool child to decide if they want to let their children socialize with other children, other families, other people outside the home, because once you go into homeschooling, you pretty much put them in an insulated environment. Okay. 13 children of David and Louise Turpin. 13 children, 10 girls and 3 boys, ages 2 to 29, were starved and imprisoned by their parents, David Allen Turpin and Louise Anna Turpin. The children were homeschooled. There we go, that homeschooling again. The Turpins moved from Texas to California around 2010 and registered their homeschool as Sandcastle Day School in 2011. Neighbors did not know how many children lived there because they rarely saw them. When the children were rescued, only 6 of them were still minors. Sandcastle listed its enrollment as 1 student in each of the 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 12th grades. However, all the Turpin's children, even the adults, were malnourished, and some were shackled to their beds with chains and padlocks in dark and foul-smelling surroundings. The abuse came to light when the Turpin's 17-year-old daughter escaped from the home and called 911 on her parents' cell phone. All 13 of the Turpin's children were hospitalized, and the Turpins were charged with torture and child endangerment. And I have a link to this website in the description. You can go in there, as you can see at the bottom, there's different documents that you can go in and look at. When I see here, police find 13 emaciated siblings, torture investigation launched, 13 siblings, some shackled to beds. So there's some more information that you can get from this website if you would like to look more into the Turpin's case. There are also plenty of videos on YouTube about them. But we see there that the age range of these children was from 2 to 29. So through the fact that the parents had isolated the children from the world under the guise of homeschooling them, they had inflicted a level of abuse and neglect on these children that even a 29-year-old adult was still basically held prisoner. And most of us would think that if we were in a situation where we were being severely abused like that, that as soon as we were legal, as soon as we were old enough, able enough, wise enough to get out the door and run and never look back, then we would do that. But here we have at least one of their children who was 11 years past the age of majority, who was still trapped in this situation. Okay. A little more information on the Turpin children. It says 13 starved, chained California children were homeschooled. Lax homeschool laws give parents the ability to isolate their children and hide abuse. The 13 Turpin children, found emaciated and chained in a home in Paris, California on Sunday, were homeschooled. This case fits a pattern we've seen of isolation and imprisonment in abusive homeschooling situations. Jesus. And again, now we see this in California. Now, we heard Stephen Lang say that in Hawaii, basically nothing is required for you to be able to homeschool a child. Here, this is a California case, and it says the same thing. For families who register as individual private schools with the state, nothing more is required. Parents do not need to submit assessments for their children's academic progress or show any evidence of homeschooling, and there is nothing done to ensure that homeschooled children have contact with mandatory reporters. So, and don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking homeschooling. I actually know some people who were homeschooled and they are smart as whips. I have always thought of homeschooling as a great thing, a wonderful thing, because it opens up so many avenues for you to be creative with the way your child learns and to customize uh, the input of information with the way that your child absorbs information, to expand on things that they might find more interesting or have uh, better acuity at, you know, things that may actually be more important in whatever it is that they want to focus on in life, whatever career path they want to take or whatever, as opposed to being forced to absorb extra amounts of things that they really don't need, won't have a use for. It gives you the opportunity to include basic life skills that schools don't teach anymore. How to balance a checkbook, how to manage a budget, to run your house. Just it's so versatile that homeschooling really can be such an excellent tool for families and a wonderful way to prepare children for the life that they're going to live after leaving school. But we also see that homeschooling, there's two sides of every coin, and homeschooling can also be the ideal mechanism for enabling um, an abuser to continue and to increase and to completely hide the abuse that they are dishing out to a child or several children, as we see here. Another thing is that in some cases, homeschooled children are just isolated. They're not even educated. Hold on a second. So this would go a long way in explaining how the 29-year-old child of the Turpins were still there. This is a possibility. It says it can be very difficult for them to leave. The older Turpin children may not have had driver's licenses or any form of identification. They were likely not given high school diplomas or any other educational records by their parents. So homeschooling puts an abuser in a position of total and complete authority over the children that they're abusing, not only controlling their interactions with the outside world, but controlling their access to information, to basic needs. Um, and I commend their 17-year-old for being able to just think, to figure out a way to get out and to get help for her and her siblings. I think that is amazing. But again, complete and total isolation, just completely separated from the world and everything that they need to even escape that situation, that abuse, that neglect. And this is the last thing that I have pulled up on the Turpins. This is on Distractify. They have some more articles linked and some more information linked to this. I am not going to go through all this. It's a pretty decent article. But it says that in 2018, police discovered 12 children who were imprisoned by their own parents in their California home. The 13 Turpin children ranged in age from 2 to 29 and had spent their entire lives tortured, chained to furniture, and unable to go outside while their parents, David and Louise, neglected and abused them. David and Louise were ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison for their crimes. And I don't think there is anything more fitting that is allowable under the U.S. justice system. But it says that early one morning, In 2018, one of the Turpin siblings managed to escape the family home and called 911 to alert the police of the kids' situation. When a search was conducted of the Turpin home, police discovered 12 other imprisoned siblings who had never left their house and were being tortured by their parents. They later found out that the siblings were routinely chained to their beds for months at a time and were often forced to live in their own excrement. The kids subsisted on a diet of peanut butter, bologna, frozen burritos, and chips, and were so malnourished that when police found them, 7 of the adult-aged siblings were mistaken for children. They were also beaten with ropes and chains and weren't allowed outside to play or even to socialize amongst themselves. And I just have so many thoughts on that. Like, they're feeding these kids peanut butter and bologna, but they look like they were eating pretty good. They don't look like they were missing any meals. And then to go so far as to the children weren't allowed to socialize even amongst themselves, or that the adults were so malnourished that they were mistaken for children. That means that they were being underfed and undernourished to a point that their growth and development was literally stunted. Now that is one of their story, and part of the reason that I will not go very deep into it is because the abuse and neglect and suffering that those children suffered was so extreme and tremendous and graphic that my mind cannot wrap around that. This next story here, I feel the same way about it. It's no less horrifying. Um, my bad. This is Therian and Ricardo Wimbush. These people, believe it or not, are actually pretty well educated. This young man was a college football star at Georgia Tech. I watched this trial on YouTube and I was amazed because when I heard the description of what had gone on with these children, it's hard to it's hard to fit the monsters in the description with who these people likely appeared to be to everyone outside their home. They're educated, they're well spoken, they they're not stupid, they're not obviously crazy, but to hear what they did to their children, and this is another case where the children were homeschooled. They were separated from the outside world. There was no outside exposure to mandatory reporters, doctors, even. I'm getting sleepy. I'm going to hurry up and get off here. But these children didn't even have access to medical care. to the point that one child it's only by the grace of God that child is still alive. And there's a link to a YouTube video. We're going to watch a little bit of that. And the link is up there. You can watch the whole trial. It's mind-boggling. Let's go ahead and watch just this section of this video. This is their son, Ricardo, named after his father. The mother, Therian, because Ricardo and Therian chose to represent themselves. And so the mother, Therian, is questioning this son. The father also presented a few questions to him, but not very many. He asked maybe 2 or 3 questions, but the key part of this particular video is the mother's questioning of him, because just his full story of what happened to him comes out. So let's listen to that. And I'm going to make sure the captions are on, because some of it is kind of hard to understand.
That's all I have. Love you, son.
All right, thank you, Mr. Winbush. Ms. Winbush, do you have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Hey, handsome.
Help us out. You usually speak a little bit louder, so I just want to make sure we can hear you.
Hey, handsome. How are you doing?
Okay. Good.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions. It's so good to see your face and that voice. I'm going to take you back a little bit. Tell me, how did you learn how to play basketball?
I think you talking.
Did you ever play basketball outside with your parents?
Yes.
Where'd you play?
In the backyard.
In the backyard. Did you ever take tumbling?
Yes.
And when you took tumbling, were you asked to be on the team for tumbling?
Yes.
Did you ever take gymnastics?
Yes.
Did you ever do karate?
Yes.
Do you remember the place that you did karate at?
Yes.
What was the name of it?
Dojo.
Dojo, yeah.
I'm sorry, what was the name?
Dojo.
Jojo.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about before your room got moved down to the basement. Had your room been moved to the basement before?
Mhm.
And did you move back upstairs after that?
Yes.
Okay. This last time that your room got moved down to the basement, do you remember things that you were doing prior to that?
Mhm.
Do you remember inappropriately touching your siblings?
Objection, Your Honor, the witnesses answered no, that he did not recall.
He was about to answer the question.
Ms. Winbush, well, she is on cross-examination, so I'm going to give her a little bit of leeway.
Do you
Rephrase your question, please?
Do you remember ever doing anything to harm your siblings?
Yes.
Are you okay with talking about that right now?
No.
No? Okay, understood. Do you remember when we talked about the need to not only protect you, but to also to protect your siblings to ensure that they were not harmed?
Yes.
Okay. What was one of the things that you disliked the very most?
About what?
What form of discipline did you dislike the very most?
A spanking.
A spanking. And did we make you a deal? Did we come to an agreement of how we could avoid you being spanked so that you didn't have to feel like, or that you didn't have to be spanked because you didn't want to be?
I think so.
Do you remember what that agreement was?
No.
Do you remember that we agreed that if we moved your room to the basement, and you could just go down to the basement to go to your room instead of being spanked when everyone else got spanked, that you wouldn't have to worry about getting spanked.
I think so.
Do you remember, well, I shouldn't say do you remember. Let's talk about some of the conversations that we had. Let's talk about the word pride. Do you remember being in Florida in the swimming pool at the hotel?
Yes.
Yes. Do you remember what happened that day?
Yes.
Okay. Will you tell us about what happened that day?
I had almost drowned because you had asked me if I had needed help while I was on one of the floaties, and I said no. And I had floated into the deep end and fell off of the floaty.
So you remember me asking you right as you were falling, do you need help?
Yes.
And what did you say?
No.
Why did you say that? And you knew you needed help?
Because I wanted to try and do things on my own.
And what happened after that?
I had fell off and almost drowned.
And who saved you that day?
You did.
It was on that trip that we made a lot of use of that DVD player. Is that correct? That one of the portable DVD players. You said there were two. What do you remember about the other one?
It was like silver. It was like it was a DVD player in the VCR.
Do you remember that one of them? You said we had two of them. Do you remember that one didn't work and one did work?
And so now that you say that.
Okay. While your room was in the basement, and let's just talk about this. Did we say that you had to stay in the basement? That your room had to stay in the basement?
That's what I remember.
Okay. So you remember talking about or making an agreement that you could avoid getting spanked by your room being in the basement, and instead of you getting spanked for doing anything wrong, that you would just be sent to your room.
Yeah.
You remember that? Okay. Do you remember having conversations with mommy about you coming back upstairs?
Yes.
Yes. So when your mommy would ask you if you were ready to come back upstairs, what would you say?
I think I said no.
And
I'm not sure.
yeah, you did. Do you know why you would have said no?
Because I didn't think that you wanted me back upstairs.
Okay. So on the days when mommy would come down and talk to you for long periods of time, what did we talk about? Do you remember? Let me ask that differently. Do you remember talking about how you treat your siblings?
Yes.
Do you remember talking about you being able to just be you, being free?
Yes.
Do you remember talking about that word pride that was on the wall?
Yes.
And the acronyms that were on the wall with the word pride. Will you talk about those? I don't know how much of that you remember at this point, but can you tell me about those words that were on the word pride, as you said, as acronyms?
They were characteristics of pride.
Characteristics of pride. Is pride a dangerous thing to have?
It depends on how and when the feeling of pride is.
Is it so? Let's use an example of if somebody's about to drown and they know they need help and they don't ask for it. Is that a dangerous time to have pride?
Yes.
So should that person just ask for help?
Yes.
Let's talk about you said there was a word humble. Can you talk about the word humble?
Yes. It's like putting yourself, like, not below, but like trying to help others before helping yourself.
I have a question for you. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
I say it's like putting yourself down to help others.
Do you remember the story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam?
Can you spell that please for the court reporter?
Rehoboam is Reheboam, and Jeroboam is Yaroboam.
Okay, repeat your question for the witness, please.
I'm gonna change the question. Do you remember the story about King Solomon's son?
No.
Do you remember reading about the people coming to ask him to relieve the burdens on them?
Yes.
And what was his response to the people? Well, let me ask you this first. The people came and asked him. And do you remember who he went to ask for advice?
Yes.
Who did he ask for advice?
His friends and his father's counselors.
Okay. And his father's counselors told him to do what?
To relieve the burden.
And do you remember what he said? Do you remember that the counselors told him, if you will serve them in this one thing? Do you remember what the rest of that said?
No.
Okay. Do you remember what advice his friends gave him?
They said to make the burden heavier.
I'm sorry. Will you say that again?
They said to make the burden heavier for the people.
And what did he choose to do?
He did what his friends said.
And how did that affect the rest of his kingdom?
The people hated him.
I'm asking you these questions just to kind of show the different things that we talk about in our household, as far as, pride and things like that. Do you remember, let's talk about the book. Let's talk about this first. I'm sorry. While your room was in the basement, do you remember building the Death Star Lego toy?
Yes.
Do you remember where you built that?
In my room.
In your room that was in the basement? Okay. Do you remember having a rocking chair in your room in the basement? Do you remember hiding the DVD player behind?
I'm sorry, Ms. Winbush. I need Ricardo Wimbush Jr., I need you to give verbal responses for the court, please. If you would not shake your head yes or no. So if you could give your last response, please.
Yes.
Thank you. You can proceed, Ms. Winbush.
That's true. My question was, do you remember hiding the DVD player behind the rocking chair in the basement, in your room?
Yes.
Were you allowed to watch movies?
Yes. When we asked for permission.
Why didn't you ask for permission to watch movies?
Because I was always afraid that you would say no.
You were afraid that I would say no. I understand. Is there anything wrong with watching movies?
No.
No. Is there anything wrong with reading books?
No.
Let me ask you this question. Did you get in trouble a lot about not asking for permission?
Yes.
Do you remember the other one thing that you got in trouble for the most?
Lying.
Lying. Will you tell us why you lied, Ricardo?
Because I never wanted to get in trouble.
Never wanted to get in trouble. Did you feel like the truth would get you in trouble?
Yes.
So were you doing things wrong that you felt like the truth would get you in trouble?
Yes.
So can I ask you this? How were you doing things that were wrong?
I don't remember.
Understood. Do you remember the incident with Hope and the book that you had? Do you remember what the name of that book was?
Alpha and Omega.
Let me ask you a question, Ricardo.
Sorry, I did not hear his response. Ricardo Jr., if you could repeat your response, the name of the book, please.
Alpha and Omega.
Thank you.
Is there anything wrong with reading the Alpha and Omega book?
No.
If you asked your mom and your daddy if you could have read the Alpha and Omega book, do you think they would have said no?
I don't think so now, but I did think.
When you took the book, how did you get that book?
I had taken it from upstairs.
Were you upstairs playing with everybody else when you took the book?
I was, now that I remember it.
You were. Do you remember how you got that book?
I had taken it downstairs.
Okay. And why did you? Go ahead.
I didn't think anybody else was paying attention.
Why didn't you just ask for permission to take the book down?
Because I didn't think he would say yes.
Did you ask to read other books?
No.
So when the book was found, do you remember who found that book?
You did, I think.
Where was the book found?
In between the mattress and box spring.
So Ricardo, did you tear away the seam of the box spring in order to be able to hide things in it?
No, that's how it was when it was upstairs, I think.
Okay. And once you noticed it was torn away, did you hide things in there? Okay. Did you hide the book in there?
No, I had to take the DVD player in there.
Okay. Do you remember when we found out about the book being down there? Do you remember this particular day? Okay.
Was that a yes, Ricardo Jr.?
Yes.
All right,
Yes.
I know it's hard, but we do need to be able to take down all of your responses, so thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So you said during that time you were able to play upstairs. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember us asking you questions or asking everybody about where this book was?
Yes.
Yes. And where did you say the book was?
I'm not sure.
Did you say
I
that?
think I said Hope was the last person to have it. I think.
Do you remember helping to look for that book?
Yes.
Did y'all look for some time for that book?
Yes.
And while y'all were looking for the book, what were you thinking?
I was worried.
Why?
I knew where the book was.
Why didn't you just say that you knew where the book was?
Because I didn't want to face consequences for having taken the book.
So looking back in time, do you find that a lot of times you didn't want to face consequences for your actions?
Yes.
And as a result, is it true that you would then lie?
Yes.
Are there times that you would lie on your siblings?
Yes.
Did you ever consider how that made them feel?
No.
So let's go back to the book day. So you said Hope was the last one that had it. Do you remember Hope crying because she thought that she lost the book?
No.
No. And when it was revealed that you had taken the book, did you feel any remorse for having lied?
No.
So, Ricardo, during the time that your room was in the basement, did your parents talk to you a lot about pride and about doing what is right?
Yes.
And what did you think about that?
That it seemed like it described me, like being prideful, and like doing what was right seemed easy, but it was hard for me.
Did your siblings often tell you, Ricardo, why don't you just do what's right?
Yes.
And how did that make you feel?
Like it was easier said than done.
Understood. Do you remember talking to your mommy about, or us talking about you coming back upstairs just maybe the day before that first person that Mr. Mayfield mentioned came to our house?
Yes.
Yes. Had we agreed that you were going to be moving back upstairs?
Yes.
Do you remember how we came to the agreement that you would be moving back upstairs?
No.
No. At that point, did you feel like you were ready to move back upstairs?
I wasn't sure.
You weren't sure, but you were ready to try. Were you ready to try?
Yes.
Did you feel like your mommy thought that you were a bad person?
No.
Will you tell me the different names that your mommy refers to you by?
Mr. Winbush.
Any other? Do you remember your mommy I'm sorry. Do you remember your mommy calling you handsome?
Yes.
Do you remember your mommy calling you phenomenal?
Yes.
Do you remember the phrase that your mama used to use to refer to you? Everything you touch
Turns to gold.
turns gold. So
Yes. All right, let's, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a 10-minute recess, and what we'll do is try to
Okay, and I played that much of that video because not only did I want you to hear like the way the communication went between her and her son so that you could get an idea of how how abused this child was, how being in such isolation from the outside world and this abuser having so much control over this child affected even the way that they just perceive the world around them, even in the confines of this small confined space within this house, within this home, within this family. If you read up on the story, you'll see where his counselors and different people said that at one point he wanted to go back to his parents so bad that he was even willing to go back to being confined in that closet in the basement just to be able to go back to his parents. So, of course, I'm thinking Stockholm syndrome to the max. Um, but this boy went through so much, and none of this would have progressed that far had he not been homeschooled, like if he had been in a position where he interacted on a regular basis with people outside the home. It said that when this young man was finally rescued from that room, that he actually had mold and fungus growing from his skin because he had not bathed the entire time he had been in that room. His sheets on his bed, when they became moldy, they were taken out of the room, but he wasn't given any clean sheets. The shirt that he was found wearing, he had been wearing since day one. Another of the siblings had a tumor, an abdominal tumor that had grown over the course of time. And it's said that the tumor was such that had it been attended to early when it was first discovered, because it had been discovered by the parents a long time ago, had it been attended to earlier, it would have been a simple outpatient surgery. But it had progressed through lack of treatment to a point where it had to be removed over the course of several surgeries. And if I remember correctly, there was a point when they were not sure if the boy would make it. This was another sibling, not the sibling that was just on the stand who was confined to the closet in the basement, but another sibling where there was severe medical neglect. And from listening to her cross-examine that child on the stand, because she also questioned the sibling who had the abdominal tumor. And from listening to her talking to that child about the tumor, this is something that more than likely would have caught the attention of a teacher, a nurse, someone in school, had they been in school, because it apparently caused the child pain, difficulty in movement. Somewhere along the line, someone would have asked them, "Are you okay? Are you hurting? Do you want to go see the nurse?" So, this article, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this article completely. I do have a couple of things highlighted, so I'll just touch on them real quick. Yeah, it's not that much. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I have a link in the description. Okay, it says Ricardo and Therian Winbush trial for child abuse and false imprisonment. The son they're accused of keeping in a darkened basement for 18 months. Can you imagine that? The other son did not receive professional medical attention while a malignant skin tumor grew on his abdomen. Now in foster care, the boy has had the tumor successfully removed and is undergoing chemotherapy. As for the son who was in the basement, it says the only objects in the room were the mattress he slept on and an animal cracker jar he urinated in when he was not allowed to use the restroom. After he ran away, his parents put a lock on the door. The older son, that's the one that was in the basement, had trouble walking up the stairs and felt weak in the legs after being removed from the basement. His nails were long and jagged, and his body was thin. The caseworker who was telling this account here recalled buying him a Whopper from Burger King and watching him ravenously devour every crumb. She said he looked like a completely different person. On a subsequent visit, she visited him sometime later. He looked like a completely different person. He had gained weight, his complexion was different, his demeanor was different. I just didn't recognize him. And about the other son's tumor, it said that it was the size of her fist. Oh, time out. And of course, that signifies the end of my live stream now that my co-host has awoken. Again, as I said, I am not downing homeschooling because for the most part, homeschooling is a wonderful option for families, especially families with alternative scheduling, um, kids with different abilities or disabilities. It can be a great tool. However, we cannot neglect to remember that it can also be used as a tool to hide abuse. We have just we watched, listened to, and read two horrible accounts of the suffering of children who were abused and whose abuse went unseen because they were homeschooled. It leaves you to question: should there be stricter guidelines or more requirements on families who want to homeschool? Should there be more supervision? Uh, Maybe that's something we can discuss at a later time. What could make homeschooling safer for children? Should foster parents be allowed to homeschool? Should parents who have only recently adopted a child be allowed to homeschool? Um, just so many things that could be considered, so many ideas of how it could be improved so that it is not so easy for someone to use it as a tool to hide their nefarious activities. Well, I am out of here. I'm going to see if I can get my co pilot back to sleep. I will see y'all next time.